Syria's corrosive spiral minorities. Syria is an important country regardless of recent developments. The Syrian state established on this strategic piece of land in the eastern Mediterranean is just a ghost of the region defined as Biladushimsh in the Ottoman administrative system, which was distorted by the colonialists and made even more stunted. As the crossroads of Asia, Europe, and Africa, Biladushimsh is today divided into 5 states: Syria, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon. Syria is the largest of these states in terms of territory and population. However, isolated from the major shores of the Mediterranean Sea by the creation of Lebanon and Israel, isolated from the world under the dictatorship of the Alawite Assad, it is a highly fragile state with an economy largely based on agriculture, scarce resources, and an eclectic and diverse demography. Clearly, Syria will continue to be the epicenter of the Arab world's political turmoil, as it has been for the past century. Now that the 54-year dictatorship of the Alawite Assad dictatorship has come to an end, going back to the beginning and focusing on the structural qualities of Syrian society, which, hand in hand with sociology and geography, produce the darkest dictatorial regime in history, will probably yield the most useful political and cultural lessons. The coasts of Syria and Lebanon and their associated hinterlands, which Westerners call the Levant, have distinctly different geographical and demographic characteristics from the Arab desert. The shape that this geography and demography have taken over time, at least in the last 1,000 years, cannot be seen in isolation from the Islamic cultural universe, which has undoubtedly been formed, remixed, and remixed in relation to the pre-Islamic conquests. The demography formed by the tight pattern of geography, economy, and politics has a pattern that can be read as a sharp separation of coasts, ovals, and mountains, deserts. With its 22 million inhabitants and 185,000 square kilometers of land, Syria is the embodiment of the harsh, contentious, and conflicted political structure produced by this geographically diverse demography. Syria, Living Archaeological Cultures Gallery. First of all, Syria and Lebanon have constituted one of the central points of the global trade networks of almost every period, starting with the Phoenicians. With these large trade networks, different cultures, political movements, and demographics, which were transported from the Arabian Desert on the one hand and the Mediterranean and Europe on the other, exhibited a behavior that can be read as short-term stays instead of settling in Syria. Alexander the Great and his successors from 300 BC to the 60s, the Persian-Roman Wars that lasted 700 years from 100 BC to 600 AD, the Christianity that emerged during this period and remixed the region, the Islamic conquest starting from 700 AD and the Crusades from 1100 AD, the Mongols, the Shiite wave that came from Iran in the same period and devastated the region. Each of these developments served to create a vibrant geography and cultural world in which enormous armies, huge human populations, rival religions, cultures, and politics moved, clashed, and transformed. Syria is perhaps the most important stage in all this eventful history. This stage has almost always served as a transit route for armies, caravans, religions, and beliefs, sometimes as a stopover, more often as a bridge. In addition to politics, these transitions and stops have left lasting and effective traces on demography, culture, beliefs, and economy. One could say that Syria is the remnant of all these incursions, this great military and civilian movement of people. A kind of microcosm of the Middle East, Syria is a living history, these living fossils, a living gallery of archaeological cultures that are blended again and again with cultures and beliefs, not only from the Middle Ages but also from prehistory. Indeed, despite the devastating social and political risks it poses, all this diversity is what makes Syria Syria. In Syria, every sect, religion, and ethnicity is linked to specific geographical regions. Damascus, Hama, and Homs in the center of the country are Sunni Arab majority centers. The Druze Mountain in the south is inhabited by the heterodox Druze community, which has resisted the Damascus regime at almost all times and has close ties with neighboring Jordan and Israel. In the north of the country is Aleppo, a cosmopolitan market and commercial center with a large number of Kurds, Turkmen, Christian Arabs, Armenians, Circassians, and Jews, who feel closer to Mosul, Baghdad, and Anatolia than Damascus. And to the west, in the Latakia region of northern Lebanon, the Alawites live in the Alawite Mountains. Salamiyya in Hama is the important center of the Nizari Ismailis in Syria. The Alawites, Druze, and Ismailis are the remnants of the Shia wave that swept across the region 1,000 years ago. A criminal dictatorship based on suspicion, fear, and hate, Assad and the Alawites. Although this contradictory diversity has at times followed a path of adaptation in the form of assimilation, dissimulation, tahiyya, stands out as an alternative adaptation strategy, especially when the Alawite minority is considered. Thus, old beliefs and ways of life were preserved under new forms of behavior. Indeed, Alawite religious elders have said, Al-Kitman jihaduna, Taqiyya is our jihad. In Syria, in a possible power composition based on minorities, almost all of whom were rivals with mutual suspicions and hatreds, a power equation other than a chaotic dictatorial regime was almost impossible. It was precisely such a chaotic equation that emerged in 1970 when Hafez al-Assad came to power after overthrowing the coup regime in which he himself had been a part with a coup d'etat. But Assad had a minority army to protect his chaotic rule. The structure of the modern Syrian army, the remnant of the French mandate's Troupes Spéciales du Levant, composed entirely of minorities and exclusively of Alawites, was in a position to provide the necessary protection for such a dictatorial regime. What Assad did, like any dictator living in fear of a coup, was to narrow the circle. Thus, it was not enough to be based on the Alawite minority. He built a cocoon of power around his own tribe, Hayatin, and gradually around his own village, Kardaha, and then around his own close relatives, the Assads and the Maloufs, on his father-in-law's side. Within this cocoon, he managed to survive in the comfort zone provided by the USSR during the Cold War, in the current created by Iranian Shiite expansionism since the 1990s, and in the last 3 years by renting the country to Russia and Iran for free. In its 54 years of rule, the Assad dynasty has vomited blood on all sectors of the Syrian people from within this increasingly criminal, increasingly narrow circle. And in the end, this dirty and criminal power, which left no other way for change but through arms and violence, disappeared, leaving behind 1 million dead, destroyed cities, a bankrupt economy, and a country sold to the colonizers. The Nusayri Hafez and his son Bashar, who have ruled Syria under heavy oppression for the last 50 years, are a kind of reincarnation of the Syrian Daisi of Hassan Saba, the old Sheikh of the mountain, Sheikh al-Jabal. Rashiduddin Sinan, who terrorized Syria for decades from the fortress of Masyaf in 1100. And before the French withdrew from Syria, the prophecy of the Alawite Sheikh Saleh al-Ali, whom they offered the position of ruler, came true. Sheikh Saleh, who rejected the offer, told the Alawite dignitaries who questioned him, "No sectarian, ethnic, or partisan group will be able to rule Syria without relying on a foreign power. Those who attempt to do so with such foreign support will bring the destruction of their minorities in Syria itself." Udi Allah Mohammed, a Syrian refugee, told me many years ago that the fragmented state of Syrian society offers the only option for the only path to stability. Among the Ismailis, the al-Sunnah Sunnis are referred to as the mother's lap of the tribes. When minorities are alone, conflict is inevitable because we all have theological and historical enmities. We are all narrow-minded and lack flexibility. Only al-Sunnah have tolerance. This sincere observation paints a striking picture when one considers the heavy conflict that has taken place in the last decade alone. The Druze distrust the Alawites hate the Ismailis. The Christians despise them all. The Orthodox are divided into dozens of conflicting sects, and on and on. The revolution and opportunities won with the blood of the Syrian people. In Syria, the sense of a demarcated homeland is to a large extent a lesser sense compared to sectarian, religious, and ethnic structures. In fact, perhaps as an innovation of the modern nation-state, the idea of a homeland in the sense of consecrating a demarcated territorial region is faint throughout the East. However, given the basic structural features of Syrian society, it is even fainter. Despite decades of indoctrination of Syrian society with Ba'athist ideology, Arab nationalism, the urbanization brought about by modern life, transportation networks, widespread means of communication, and a partially modernized socio-economic structure, the influence of the aforementioned closed minority structures could not be broken. This is partly due to esoteric theologies, but mostly to the equation of interests and security created by the Assad dictatorship's instrumentalization of minority fears. Ethnic and sectarian differences are not in themselves a cause of conflict. They almost always become an element, party, or target of conflict when a political power focus instrumentalizes these social structures. This is what happened in Syria. The Syrian revolution overthrew the Assad dictatorship in less than a week, with a speed that surprised many analysts. However, it should not be forgotten that behind this rapid collapse lies 14 years of resistance and 54 years of decay. In the last 2 years, the regime's army was nothing more than a gang of dirty interests led by the Assads, who could not even provide their soldiers with a daily meal and were involved in smuggling, kidnapping for ransom, rape, and drug crimes. These gangs, whose political motivation was over, had no strength, support, or motivation to resist the resistance of the Syrian people. Syria will now lick its wounds, having experienced again and again in a bloody way, as it has in its history, how destructive the minority power equation is. The social trauma of this experience will probably take decades to heal. Syria now has a bright future ahead of it, not without risks. If it manages to turn its diversity into an asset, despite its limited resources, fragmented demography, and security risks from Israel, Syria will recover quickly, possibly building the only democracy in the Arab world.